All right. Peace and greetings, YouTubers. So a lot of you were asking me about my 2 cents in regards to T.I and the statements he's made around his daughter. If you didn't know, he's been catching a bunch of flack and there's a lot of controversy surrounding some of the statements he's made in the past few days. He recently went on a podcast, and on the podcast, he was talking about the lengths that he would go through to protect the sanctity of his daughter's body as far as her virginity. And so he says how every year he would take her to the gynecologist to double check if her hymen was still intact, and that way he could tell if she was a virgin, and if everything was good to go, everything was good to go. And of course, these statements blow up. There's a lot of controversy. People are like, what the heck? Even when I first saw it, I said, wait, whoa. Okay, a little too much information, but wow, very intrusive. Okay. And so he ends up going on Jada Pinkett's Red Table Talk to try to clear up some of the statements. And pretty much he says that his words were pretty much misconstrued and over sensationalized and taken out of context. And he wanted everybody to know that when he did take the daughter to the gynecologist, this was when she was still a teenager, like 15, 16, 17. The daughter is now an adult. He also wanted everybody to know that the mother was supportive of it, and he also was not in the room when this all happened. And so, there's been a bunch of conversations, so we're just going to have one ourselves. And so here's my 2 cents on a lot of things. One, I think one of the important aspects when raising a teenager, especially a teenage daughter, especially if you're a black male raising a teenage daughter, there's two things that are really important. One is trust and one is security. You have to have a healthy balance of both in order to really have a great relationship with your teenager. And I'm only speaking from my experience when working with youth and when I have to sit in and one step from be a counselor sometimes. But yeah, I definitely think the two important aspects if you want a healthy relationship with your teenage child is one, a great balance of trust and security. Because if you can trust your kids and your kids know that you trust them, I just think the lines of communication open. And when there are those moments where they're unsure about some things, or maybe they're thinking about making some decisions that you don't really align with, at least because that element of trust is there, they're open to having that conversation with you, and they're open to receiving the information that you may give to them. Whether they take it or not is kind of on them, but when they know that there's trust, they're willing to at least be open. And then that element of security, especially when you're a father raising a daughter, that element of security, and not security just in the physical aspect, but security in the emotional aspect. The idea of knowing that you're supported, the idea of knowing that if something were to hit the fan, your father has your back, and not your back in the aspect of how he would respond for his ego, but how he would respond more so for your protection and for your well-being. That element of security. And so I think when those two elements ever become compromised, the relationship it shifts, it changes. And everybody knows that with teenagers, it's already a roller coaster ride. It really is, because their hormones are all over the place, so they're having mood swings. They starting to act crazy. They're turning into somebody you don't know. Mainly because with teenagers, this is the time in life when they start to get their own viewpoints of how they see the world. Because think about it, before they're teenagers, when they're 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, their viewpoints align with everything that you've taught them, everything that you believe, everything that you see. They are pretty much a reflection of you. But as they get older, as they become more socialized, as they start middle school, as they become influenced by music and TV and books or whatever it is that they're into, their viewpoints change. Their perceptions of the world change. Their perspective of how they see and do things start to change. And so this is when parents and teenagers start to clash. Ideals start to clash, all right? And I think it becomes even more chaotic when you're talking about the ideals of a father raising a teenage daughter, especially in a society where our ideals are measured around or morphed around the ideals of men anyway. You know what I mean? Can we be honest? I think Jada Pinkett did have a very good point when she was talking about how, when you're talking about like the moral compass of the world, or you're talking about how society is set up. It's always been set up through the lens of men. That's no secret. And so, adding a teenager into that aspect makes it even more controversial. So I think for T.I.'s situation, you have to look at the optics. What does that say to your teenage daughter if you go and you take her to the gynecologist and you let some random persons, pretty much, I'm just going to say, violate her to appease something that's itching you? You know what I mean? Like literally, what does that say about trust? That says, even if we built a relationship of trust, I don't trust you like that. So I'm going to violate this trust relationship we built, and I'm going to put you into the room with some stranger, and that stranger is going to pretty much one step from violate you. So not only have you compromised the element of trust, but you've compromised the element of security, that emotional security of knowing that your father has your back. What does that say to the girl? What does she feel like knowing, not only does my father not trust me in that aspect, but now, they got me in this room with this random person and I feel humiliated. Like, and to make things worse, I understand the aspect of wanting to protect your kids. I understand the aspect of, because again, fathers love their daughters most of the time, depending on who's raising who. But, and daughters love their fathers. That's a great dynamic. Same as far as like a mother raising the son and vice versa. Everybody loves everybody, but I just think there's a special bond that fathers have with their daughters, just like mothers have with their sons. But I get you're trying to protect your daughter, but think about how much worse you made it when not only did you go and put her in the room with the gynecologist to spread her legs every year, but then you talk about it on a podcast. You're a public figure with millions of people who watch your every move. And so now, even with the violation, I would say, of you sending your daughter to the gynecologist to go spread her legs to be checked, so up to your standard, you then talk about it. And so millions of people are now familiar with your daughter, something that, and not familiar with like your daughter's achievements, but something that she wouldn't want everybody to know about. So really, while you were trying to protect her, you did more damage in the long run. And I think that's something you have to kind of be careful about and think about. You don't want to ever damage that aspect or that dynamic, because it's really hard to repair. I think the teenage years and even the young adult years, those are the years of the trial and error between parents and their kids, but those are the years that build up to determine whether or not there's going to be a great relationship once that child becomes a much older adult. If you don't have that great teenage relationship with your child, or even the young adult when they're 21, 22, 23, they're going to spend the rest of their 20s arguing with you about everything you did wrong and back and forth, and y'all not talking to this person, and this person's not coming over for Christmas, and you can't, it's chaos. And so I really think, again, that element of trust and security is so important, and you don't want to violate it. And again, teenagers are going to be teenagers. I'm not saying or endorsing anything that teenagers do, but I think you have to have different methods when it comes to wanting to ensure that your teenagers are safe and that your teenagers are making the right decisions. I think the role of a parent shifts over the years. And so when I saw T.I. do that came off to me as, okay, you're still in the wrong phase of this parenthood thing. Like, I think as a parent, those beginning years are all about nurturing. Those toddler baby years, primary stages, nurturing. I love you. You're so smart. Let's do ABCs. I'm going to give you everything you want. I love, and I'm your security blanket. Love you. There's that element. Then as your kids get older and they get into that state where you start teaching them there are consequences to your actions, and I'm teaching you right from wrong. This is that stage when they're 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I'm teaching you, all about different things, and this is what happens when you do this, and this is what happens when you do that. And then when they become teenagers and young adults like 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, it's more so, I've loved on you, I've nurtured you, I've been your security, I've showed you right from wrong, and now I'm allowing you to go on your own path and utilize the tools that I've given you to make the right decisions for yourself. And if you end up going in the wrong direction, I'm going to try my best to help steer you back in the right direction, and we're going to go from there. That's kind of where I see the dynamics of a parent's relationship change. And then, of course, as you fast forward and your child becomes like in their 30s and everything like that, then the relationship is a much, it's when parents really love their children a whole lot more, I feel like, when they're like adults. Because now it's like, okay, now you've seen the outcomes of your work. You've seen the outcomes of all the love and investment you've put into your child. And you get to see them flourish. You planted the seed has grown, it's sprouted, and your children are great. That's the ideal way of doing things. But something like taking your daughter to the gynecologist to go be checked, it's backwards on that spectrum. And so it just kind of shows, okay, that trust aspect is a little chaotic, you know what I mean? And I think, again, you have to understand, like, everybody knows the code with working with teenagers. You can tell them not to do something all you want, but they're gonna do it because it becomes something that becomes intriguing. They become inquisitive. So when you come at your teenagers with a very punitive approach, or an approach where you try to scare the life out of them about something, they end up more likely going to go do whatever it is you don't want them to do. It's kind of like DARE. Remember the DARE program? Like, if you went to school in the late 80s or the 90s or maybe the early 2000s, they had DARE, drug abuse resistance education. And this was supposed to be something that would scare kids to not do drugs and, drink and all this other stuff. And then it turned out that DARE did not work at all, as a matter of fact. So I think they did a study between 1991 and 1995, and it turned out that literally illicit drug use amongst youth doubled. And these were the kids that were in the DARE programs. It doubled from 11% to 21%. And the research, people were like, we can't figure out why. And it turned out, okay, well, if you keep introducing the kids to all of these things that are so dangerous, and you sensationalize them and put the fear of God in them around these things, the kids become intrigued. They become, again, like I said, very just intuitive. They like, oh, I want to see inquisitive. Let's go do it. And so, boom, now all the kids are lining up cocaine and drinking and doing everything else you didn't want them to do. And so, again, I think you just have to be careful as a parent to make sure you don't burn the wrong bridges, especially with teenagers, because a relationship raising a teenager is so fragile. Teenagers are already waiting for you to, like, they already want to get out of the house. You get on their nerves, they get on your nerves, everybody get on everybody's nerves, everybody's tired of everybody. Can't wait for you to go to school. Keep talking trash. You better get a full ride because I ain't paying for nothing. Like, that's the relationship with some families. But I think an even bigger aspect, because this is a dynamic of a male raising a daughter, is you also have to understand the conversation of agency. You know, I think that's the most important aspect. By you taking your daughter to the gynecologist and having her checked to see if she's a virgin, you've taken away her agency. Because agency, again, and that conversation can go so many places, because when we really talk about black women, I personally just don't think black women have ever really had agency over their own bodies, unfortunately, because of how society is structured. And you can go back to the times during slavery when women were forced to have children they did not want to have with people they didn't want to have children with, as far as them being raped on plantations and everything like that. And you can even just talk about globally how so many women are castrated. Well, really, I would say mutilated, because I don't even consider that a castration. You know, castration amongst men is more so you're cutting the foreskin, but that doesn't play a role or an effect on the male sexual performance, and it doesn't make any difference with anything in comparison to something like female castration, which, did I say castration? I meant circumcision. I'm sorry. I'm so used to saying castration because we're always talking about slavery on here, but female circumcision. When you're talking about how that's done, I consider that more like mutilation. This part's a little graphic, so bear with me. You might want to fast forward for the next 30 seconds. But like when you're talking about female circumcision, their clitoris is cut off, which, you know, that's one of the main aspects of stimulation for women. In addition to that, the labia is cut off and the vulva is kind of cut down, and then everything is sewed up, and literally they stitch everything down to the point where there's only enough space for the woman to menstruate and urinate. And so think of how graphic that is. And that usually happens in places where the society is overly dominated by men and they have agency over what women can do with their bodies. And then the sad aspect is when women finally do, you know, when they do get married in some of these places where they do that and the stitches are removed and it's time for intercourse, it's not even enjoyable, because if everything isn't already infected, because most of the time these mutilations are not even done in like a hospital. They're kind of just done, you know, with nothing sterilized and done with a razor. You know, it's an extremely painful and unpleasurable experience for a lot of women. And so then it pretty much, because a lot of women have no interest in having anything related to sex at that point, then you see an increase in rape. So it's like everything just ties in a circle. But again, like with that agency, you don't want to take that from her. And let me bring it back home a bit as far as this agency conversation. Picture it this way. Think about like when a parent will bathe their child. If a father has to bathe their daughter, it makes sense when the daughter's a baby. You know, you wash the baby in the tub. It makes sense when the daughter's in the primary stages, when she's 3 or 4, okay, or even toddler. It even makes sense when she's 5 or 6 and maybe 7. But think about when that daughter hits 8, 9, or 10 years old. And now she's starting to discover herself. She starts to gain her own agency over her body, where she's like, she wants her own privacy. Dad, I don't need you in here. Maybe mom can come in. Or if she starts her cycle or something, it's usually not the dad that's having the conversation about what that all means, unless it's a situation where it's like a single parent. But even then, the dad usually goes and gets an aunt, or that dad gets grandma, or the big sister, or somebody else to have that conversation. You know, the daughter starts to develop her own sense of self, where the father is still respected and loved, but there are some boundaries that are now set, where there are some things that are more so off limits because the daughter needs her own space. And then think about by the time the daughter's a teenager, picture how weird that would be if you're the father and you're bathing your 17-year-old daughter. You see what I mean? Like, that sounds awkward. The only way that could sound somewhat normalized is if it's a situation where the daughter is in need of like home care, like she's physically disabled and she can't do that herself. Then that may somehow make sense. But that's what I mean, like agency. So I think the conversation of understanding that, yes, you are the parent and that is your child, but you don't control their body. You don't have access to every element of them as they get older because they're developing into their own person. And I think, again, it's a hard conversation, and it's very tricky because it's hard to raise teenagers, and it's really hard to raise teenage girls, just like it's hard to raise teenage boys. But the part that I found funny is just the contradiction, because he had all of this energy for the daughter, but then with the sons, he was like, it is what it is. Even when he said the bit about, well, if the daughter came home pregnant, that would change the dynamics of the house for 9 months, as opposed to if the son came home and got a girl pregnant, nothing changes for 9 months. And I'm like, but when that 9 months is over, there's still a baby there. So, see what I mean? So it's like, you don't want anybody violating, well, I don't even say violating. You don't want anybody touching your daughter in that way sexually. However, you're fine with your sons going and doing that to somebody else's daughter. Like, you figure out your energy, figure out whatever it is you want to do. I just think it's a very unique conversation. I think he means well. He's just not in the know on some things. And I think there's some elements where as a parent, you have to fall back. And I think as a man, if you're raising a daughter, you do have to respect at the end of the day that she's still a young woman, or she's a woman. And there's some things as a man that you have to fall back on where you don't have access to, because there's some doors that just close as your daughter gets older. Same thing like if it's a mother raising a son. I would say the same thing. There's some doors that close. And I think that goes back to that conversation of trust and security. If you want that good relationship with your teenage son or your teenage daughter, that balance of trust and security has to be there. And you just have to trust that you've raised your children to make the right decisions. And if they don't make the decisions you align with, at the end of the day, if you put in all of the right tools with them, they're still going to end up on the right path either way. I mean, that's the ideal situation. Does that happen with everybody? No. But I definitely don't think you going and dropping your child off to the gynecologist to be checked every year helps the situation either. I think, with children, there's no one size fits all solution. It's every situation is unique. And I think the relationship you build with your children, it comes through time and conversation and communication and understanding each other. And so if you walk around with this macho, I'm always right, and you don't know anything and do as I say all the time, and your child is 17, 18 years old, like, what do you expect the relationship to be like? It's kind of like the Parkers. Like, remember how, like, Nikki Parker used to always threaten to whoop Kim, and Kim was, like, 19, 20 years old? Like, even when Nikki moved in Kim's apartment, how about I whip your butt? Kim is, like, 21. It don't work. Okay. All right. So, yeah. Crazy conversation. I guess there's a part 2 on the Red Table Talk that airs, I guess, next week or something? I don't know if they're still talking about that situation, but I do think there's some conversations to be had, and I definitely think, again, with raising teenagers, especially if you're a father raising a teenage daughter, you have to respect her plight as a woman as well, because at the end of the day, you're still looking at the world through a male privilege lens that she will never get to experience, unfortunately, because of how society's set up. So you have to be careful with how you approach certain things, because in order to keep that trust and that bond with your daughter, you don't want her to feel like you're violating her. You don't want her to feel like you've just taken away her sense of agency. And anyway, that's all I got for you. So that's my 2 cents. If you don't agree, it's cool what it is, or it is what it is, But anyway, share your 2 cents. I'm out. Subscribe.